welcome to this discussion titled Good Design and Heritage Where New Meets Old as part of the MPavilion program. And today's conversation is presented by Heritage Council of Victoria and the Office of the Victorian Government Architect. My name is Fleur Watson. I'm the Executive Director for the Centre for Architecture Victoria and Open House Melbourne, and I'm really pleased to be here moderating this discussion today with these three incredible women. So I think it's important that we recognise that it's NAIDOC Week at the moment with the theme Always Was, Always Will Be, which recognises that our First Nations people have occupied and cared for this land for over 65,000 years. I'd like to acknowledge the Yalukit Willam as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording today. The Yalukit Willam are part of the Bunurong, one of the 5 major language groups of the Greater Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to their lands, their ancestors and their elders, past, present and emerging. And from Docklands, where we're here today, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all watching today. Wamanjika, everybody. So heritage buildings and places are treasured and loved by the general public. Yet, as our world changes and our lives are continually changing very dramatically, those treasured places sometimes need to be reimagined. Today, we've gathered a panel of 3 experienced and leading architects to discuss this really important topic. I'm very pleased to welcome Jill Gardner from the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, Christine Phillips, RMIT academic, architect and member of the Heritage Council of Victoria, and Kirsten Thompson from Kirsten Thompson Architects. And firstly, Jill, Christine and Kirsten are all going to present some images of places that they feel represent an example of where good design and heritage meet to really fulfil the contemporary needs of the city. Then we're going to follow up with a conversation of how good design can be matched with heritage to provide buildings and places that endure and will be loved by the community well into the future as well as our past. So Jill, can I invite you to talk through your images?
Great, thanks Fleur. Just before I start on my 2 selected projects, I wanted to take a minute just to highlight the absolute importance of this discussion that we're having. And significantly, I guess it will be pretty obvious that the 2 examples that I've chosen are not local examples. And partly that's because I feel like each of the projects that I've chosen showcase a philosophical position to heritage that I'm not sure has been matured in our own city as yet. Present company accepted. There's some lovely work being done. But I think, after centuries of addressing heritage and new in the European city, there's a simple ease of approach that the designers in Europe bring. So I have chosen 2 examples from overseas. I'm hesitant to admit it, but we can talk about local ones later. So I always think it's interesting because from a design point of view, heritage is approached in various ways. You can overlay something, you can interweave something, you can juxtapose a new with an old, you can maybe wrap it as well, or you could insert something into the old with the new. So the first project I've got here is by a Spanish architect whose name is Carles Enric, excuse my language there. I actually haven't had the privilege of seeing this project in the flesh. I saw it at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, and it was the year that Spain won the Golden Lion Award, and they had an amazing presentation in their pavilion which was called Unfinished. And it basically dealt with, most of the projects in it were dealing with heritage buildings because, in a way that was the nature of Spain, or is the nature of Spain and architecture in the projects that they chose. So this particular project is a very simple one. It's a 20-metre high elevator, and it was inserted into a series of amazing project examples that were in this particular exhibition. And the majority addressed heritage. So it was fascinating to see the skill with which the Spanish architects dealt with their heritage environment. This lift is located next to a Catalan cliffside, and there's a 20-metre vertical break between the old part of the town and the new part of the town. And the lift is designed to connect these two halves of the city. So till now, the old part, the two parts have been linked by a rather old rickety staircase, and you can imagine what that staircase was like, very uneven, and so it wasn't well used. And basically, what has happened over time, over many, many years, it's generated a social dislocation of the old town and the new town, and the people who live in each part of the city as well. So the concept behind this project was clearly to alter this social condition that was attached to this particular place. And so the idea was to increase footfall between the lower part of the town, the old town and the new town, and to the castle at the top of the cliff, and to a public square which has been located at the bottom of the cliff. So it's kind of a public place intervention. And I suppose I would call this kind of architecture approach to heritage something like a parasite. It's kind of something that's been just inserted into the existing, but it stays separate. And you can see in the images there's a very careful separation, a little bridge that takes you from new to old. There's so many issues embedded in this project that I think are really important in tackling heritage, and most of them are related to contextual and formal fit. So there's a kind of an analysis of the urban structure and the grain of the place where it sits. There's a really clear analysis of materiality. And there's also an amazing discussion about form and scale. And all of those elements have informed the project and informed the project outcome. So the walls, just to describe it a bit, the walls are perforated brickwork. That acts as a solar filter, it's a ventilated shaft, and it gives a glimpse of the countryside as you're travelling through a glass lift. And it's really light when you're up close, but it has this denseness when you're quite a distance, and it reflects some of the tower structures that you see in the old town. So the top 16 metres are wrapped with this brickwork, and then the bottom, as you see, are completely clear glass. So there's this amazing sort of, the success of it is that what the new does is it's equal to its host place. It puts something brand new next to its host place, but it's of equal design value. And I think that's what's extremely important in heritage work. So my second slide is, I've chosen this one. This is a museum, and it's spread over 9 floors, carved out of a monumental industrial structure in Cape Town. It's a grain silo, and in South Africa, obviously. The silos have been empty since about 1990, I think, and they were at one time the tallest structure in this particular part of Cape Town. Designed by Heatherwick Studio, this is a reminder of the city's industrial heritage, and it's given a whole new life, not just to this particular building, but to this area. It's a really masterful transformation. And I think it's an architecture that combines 2 approaches to heritage, probably juxtaposition and weaving. In a way, this has a building that's located adjacent to the existing building that kind of makes sense of it in its place, but it's also woven a whole new interior, and it's had what I call judicious demolition. And so parts of it have been carefully removed, and you're left with something quite new after that removal has taken place. So the principles against which this one can be judged is this sort of layers of local history that have generated the urban patterns within the area, and it's impacted the form and the grain of the outcome. And then there's also 2 design approaches. First is to add or sort of judiciously take away from the existing structure. And then there's this masterful erosion of the interior and this amazing balance between new and old. I think, if I recall, there's a huge number of galleries a huge number of silos in this particular original structure. And I think 42 tubes of structure is embedded in this particular composition. And what Heatherwick have done is burrowed out in between those 42 silos and created a honeycomb of these extraordinary caverns within, which are amazing places to view objects within the museum. And then it's given this particular part of this industrial part of town a new urban life. It's still a landmark, which is really critical, but it's picked up its positives and negatives in its facades from its local environment as well. So it's an incredibly sensitive balance of a contextual response, apart from the interior, which is quite an extraordinary kind of honeycomb of interesting variation to what's there. So that's probably all I have to say about my two projects, and we'll no doubt have some questions.
We'll pick it up absolutely in the conversation. Thank you, Jill. Over to you, Christine, for your examples.
Thank you, Fleur, and thank you, Jill. I agree, they're both outstanding examples. So just to follow on Jill's discussion, I've selected an international example and a local example. And while I think they're both outstanding projects, I'd have to say I think the local one does it better than the international. And I'll talk to that soon. So the first example is a project in Madrid, which was designed by a very well-known international practice, Herzog and de Meuron. And it took a disused power station and reimagined it for the city in a really new and beautiful and exciting way. And I think this is one of the things that's quite tricky about adaptive reuse is we often get a lot of industrial buildings that are no longer useful due to technological advancements and so forth. So how do we rethink them and reimagine them in new ways? And I think this does a great job of that by transforming it into a series of art galleries and cultural spaces for the city. It does it in a pretty interesting way, and a little bit similar to the Heatherwick example. There's quite a lot of innovation that is used. And if you look at the base of the building, you'll see it's almost as though they sliced it horizontally like a cake. And what that does is it opens it up for the public and invites the public in a really great way. So that, I think, was a really good move on this project. The other thing I think is really terrific about this project is the relationship between the new fabric and the existing fabric. And as you can see, it's clearly got a different materiality to it, but it's quite considerate of the existing fabric. But you can see a clear distinction between the new and the old. So I think that's what's really important about adaptive reuse architecture, is that it needs to clearly articulate that difference between the new and the old. And you can see also in the form of the new volume that's on the top of it also speaks to the buildings around, and it's located in quite a dense urban fabric within Madrid. So I think it's a great example. The second one, if someone might be able to help me bring it up, is here. So the second example I selected is located in Sydney. So it's a really great practice, Tonkins, Alaka and Greer, who I think, like Kirsten Thompson, do a terrific job of dealing with existing buildings. And this is the Carriage Work Arts Centre in Sydney. So this was a disused railway workshops, and it's part of a suite of these workshops, which are no longer have any use. And they've just done such a beautiful job of inserting new things within it, rethinking the fabric, understanding the structure in such a sophisticated way that you really appreciate the new fabric and you also really appreciate the existing. And one of the clever things is they inserted a series of these volumes within the space so that you really appreciate and you can read the beautiful structure within these great old sheds as very separate volumes within the space. So you get a bit of a dialogue happening between the new and the old. But I thought what was also very clever was in areas where they had to create volumes of higher spaces than the structure allowed for, they had to actually take some of that structure out. But they relocated that structure in other areas, so nothing got wasted and it all got rethought and reimagined in stunning ways. So it's just a beautiful example of what we can do with old industrial buildings.
Yeah. Great.
And over to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Christina. Really good precedents, all of these ones we've looked at so far. I have a couple of images of Broadmeadows Town Hall, which I confess is one of our own projects, but I did think that it's a good one to raise some questions really we have, or propositions around heritage. First of all, what do we mean by heritage? Fleur, I think in your introduction when you talked about NAIDOC, and I thought one of the things that as architects especially we sometimes suffer from is imagining that there is such a thing as a site with no heritage. You know, every site has a heritage of some sort and it's just how we choose to see it and understand it. So that's the first thing. There's nothing outside of time or space, so to speak. So that's the first point. The second thing is that the Broadmeadows Town Hall is a relatively late building in that it's from the 60s, and so it's also a question around, you know, how old does something have to be before we start to think it has some sort of heritage value? And you could say that anywhere that has some sort of connection through its community has some heritage value. So to be respected and considered in any changes that might be made to it. So in the case of Broadmeadows Town Hall, it was sadly a building that had been abandoned somewhat. It was originally built as a town hall, and then things had changed, become a bit obsolete in some parts, too big as a town hall, but not small enough for a whole lot of things. And too mono, it was only doing one thing and it maybe needed to work a bit harder, and in fact is now a combination of cultural and commercial as well as civic purposes. But the other thing about it is that it was not a building of necessarily significant architectural merit, but it was a really important space for that community. A lot of things had happened there, and so again that's why it was valuable as a sort of repository of that community's memories. So for us, a few things. First of all, the events that happen there and the stories we tell about those, that's part of its history, and we can keep those alive. And in fact, the Hume City Council commissioned a film which does capture a lot of those in a beautiful series of interviews with people and sequences describing its uses, whether it's for car club meets or basketball games or ballroom dancing or debutantes or immunisations or and so on, migration ceremonies and so on. So the second thing is that it's, especially in its interiors, we felt that it was very important to hold on to some of the material qualities of it and some of its details, because we thought they have served purpose as a sort of background to people's life events, you know, and you see buildings in the backgrounds of photos of people, and so it seemed important to continue to register and honour some of those aspects of the material qualities as a connection to people's past. But the big question for us is just, I think, Jill, you touched on this, the sorts of ways in which new and old or change might happen to buildings. We often talk about it as a spectrum of change, from not much physical change but a change in use, to dramatic physical change but no change in use, and then a whole lot of things in between. So we have felt that a lot of discussions around heritage are very much either one or the other, and we've always found that sort of messy middle ground far more interesting. So this is again an example of, on the one hand, trying to hold on to key details, especially internally, that we thought were valued by people, and then also make some radical change, especially to enable new uses for the building. And so this image here with the big round circle was really taking what was always a secondary and, a fairly poor address to what is a car park, essentially, but certainly not in any way inviting. And so the big circle, which we sometimes call an urban bullseye, is just a way to celebrate that it's now more open for business and use than perhaps it had been before. So there's that urban initiative as well, through the change, not just for the internal activities. So that's probably... And I should just say the second image, which shows that sort of beautiful curl, is to just say that art is another way in which the history and the heritage of place can be engaged with. This is a piece by Robbie Rowlands, and that spiral is formed from a cut he made and then sort of edit to the supper room timber floor, and which he subsequently turned into this beautiful piece hanging in the main foyer, which is part of the sort of civic spaces. Interestingly, when he made that cut in the ground, what he revealed, because it was part of a sort of performative piece, was the ground beneath the building, which hadn't been exposed to, our eyes for at least 60 years. So it was a beautiful way of conjuring or telling us something of the precondition of the building and registering that in the piece. So a project of where both the additions and also what we took away and the edits is as important as what you add. So thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, everyone. They were really, really inspiring and thought-provoking examples, and we're going to come back to the examples in a minute. And this is very much considered a conversation. So I'm going to kick off with a few questions. But if you've got questions of each other and there's certain kind of things that you'd like to pull out, please let's have it going around us. Christine, I'd like to start with you if I can. And I think if we can kind of step back a little bit from the examples, and if you can explain the role of the Heritage Council of Victoria, and particularly how state heritage listing differs from local heritage recognition. If you can kind of define that for us.
Sure, Fleur. I think that's a really important question and something which the Heritage Council asks a lot. So the Heritage Council of Victoria is an independent statutory body that is really there to promote and protect the cultural heritage of Victoria for all of us, but also for our future generations. We seek to advocate and also to communicate and let everyone know how important it is that we protect our cultural heritage. Within that sort of broader role, we do a lot of things like we get to decide what items get added and removed from the Victorian Heritage Register. So the Victorian Heritage Register is essentially a register of all of the state's places and objects that are of state level significance. So that's one of the roles. We also advise the Minister of Planning on the protection and conservation of our cultural heritage. And we also have a broader role to promote and communicate the importance to the general public. So they're the sort of main roles of the heritage. Now, talking to the second part of your question on what differentiates a state from a local, I think that's a really good question and one that I think is best explained through an example. But essentially, what defines a state heritage place or object is one that tells a story about Victoria's history and development, as opposed to something which is speaking to a community or a place, as Kirsten was talking to before. There are a set of 8 criteria which help to unpack and define that level of state significance. And if people wanted to find out more, it's all up on the Heritage Council's website. So that's the main difference. It's really about something that describes Victoria's history and development. And there's a great example I can think of is the sewerage pumping station in Spotswood, which many of you might know as Science Works. This was the main component that contributed to Melbourne's first sewerage system. So that is telling a lot about the development of our sewerage system. So it's not about describing anything about Spotswood or about the significance to that area, but it's helping us all understand that aspect of Victoria's history and development. So local heritage places are included and managed by local councils and within heritage overlays, and they are very much about that particular area. So that's what defines those 2 different kinds of heritage places and objects.
And what about the Borough Charter? What role does that play in guiding the management of heritage?
Yes, so the Borough Charter is a national charter, and it's really there to provide some overarching guiding principles about how we conserve and manage places of significance. Anyone can look it up, it's online. I think probably the takeaway from message of the Borough Charter is that when dealing with existing heritage, we should do as much as is required to maintain the place and make it usable, but we should also do as little as possible in order to maintain that heritage.
So I want to extend on that a little bit with Jill, if I can. So if we think about the Borough Charter identifying basically 3 levels of repair for heritage fabric, preservation, repair and reconstruction, do you think there's a need perhaps for the Borough Charter to include a 4th level, the idea of reimagining a place through contemporary architecture?
I think inherent in the Borough Charter is that ambition, and really what the Borough Charter is there to do is to protect that needs protection and to identify the parts that maybe don't. I mean, one of the interesting things that I think sometimes we see in Melbourne, I guess I'm speaking from, is some nervousness about, is this good heritage or is it bad heritage? Can I do better than this? Will I keep this? We'll be talking about street walls, I'm sure. Should I keep this street wall because I as an architect can't design something better than this? Or could I actually do a better job than the street wall that's already here? So I think what's interesting about the Borough Charter is it sets the scene for a skillful architect to come in and work with what's important, but remove that which is deemed to be less important. They're ultimately, like every architectural project, it's the skill of the hand and the skill of the designer to get to either a great outcome or a less than satisfactory outcome.
And I think maybe this brings me to Kirsten, because there is, Kirsten, your work is widely recognised as being incredibly sensitive and dexterous and able to bring the skill of the hand to a heritage project. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced and the kind of buildings that you found most challenging in terms of that balance that Jill talks about.
Okay. It's interesting because I think a lot of the time the difficulty tends to be, I have confidence there is always a way you can manage this through architecture, and sometimes it's the process itself of getting agreement about what that is the most demanding part of it. So I think for instance, and that probably leads to some of the challenges around how we understand or assess heritage value. And I think there are some more sophisticated understandings, and then we do find ourselves quite often, caught in a less nuanced way of thinking about heritage. So, for example, I think that sometimes there is, especially when something is of a very high value for its architectural integrity, then it can get, and I'm thinking of a project in the city, without naming names, where it was of such high value as an artefact that to make a case for why it could be changed on a more urban design position was very difficult, because the way it was assessed was as a self-contained object, really, rather than as part of a city, and therefore as part of a bigger system that was interconnected with a whole lot of other considerations. And so I think we found the biggest challenge is when a building gets isolated for the purpose of discussions of its value outside of this bigger contribution it makes as one piece within a much more complex arrangement or relations that makes the city. And so, our question is, how could the change in that instance, how could a small change, we thought, to its fabric unlock a whole lot of other potentialities for that site and a degree of life that was missing. And that was what took the time to advocate and demonstrate that on balance this was the right sort of change to happen. So I don't know if that answers the question. But
could I make an observation?
Yes, please.
Kirsten, you've interestingly brought the discussion to the city.
Right.
And I think what is interesting about all the examples that were shown by our panel is that they're all of a proportion and of a scale that is not that challenging. I mean, all of the projects that we looked at, the architects have been able to really bring balance to the project, because they're not actually doing what we see in our central city, which is, I want to put a skyscraper over the top of this building. Yeah. And I think one of our biggest challenges in Melbourne is that concept of our sites. I mean, I've said this before, the sites in our HODL grid are so valuable that what they owe, I suppose, to their owners is a great deal of development. And I guess that's where none of us have shown a building that towers over its heritage fragment or hangs over the heritage fragment or even envelops the heritage fragment. We've shown very sensitively scaled pieces that sit quite politely, or in Kirsten, in your case, a really gentle kind of taking away of fabric to turn it into something new. Yeah. And in a way, that's more acceptable and more palatable.
Sort of easier runs.
It's an easier thing to do. Yeah. And I do have another observation about Melbourne, which is something that we do very well, is we do some of those smaller scale things really well. If I think about the Shrine, and I could have put that up, or I could have put up Parliament House, for example. But they've gone down. So what they've actually done is said, I'm going to give primacy to the heritage neighbour, and I'm going to hide. And that my new bit is quite different. Yeah. And so they're, in a way, once again, while they're challenging projects to undertake, they're not challenging formally.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think, and that's one other thing I'd add to that discussion is just, I do think there are some lazy defaults in heritage, and I sometimes have talked about these, especially when we're, putting in a project for approval. And for example, I think what you said earlier when you said that the good examples treat the new and the old on an equal footing. And I think, unfortunately, we have this strange idea about one being subservient to the other rather than, as I would like to say, it's peer-to-peer. So the biggest one for me has always been this default to the setback, which is based on the premise of invisibility or, setting something back so it's less visible. Well, why? So I know in a number of our projects we've challenged that, and even that tower question of tower over a small building where we, instead of doing the setback and where we thought that the single line made sense in the urban context, the veil over the top even was another way to do it, but it's just not in the vocabulary of the authorities sometimes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Did you want to
Yeah,
add to
it
that,
did.
Christine?
When both of you were talking, I did think of the Melbourne Museum by DCM as a really great example of a building. And while it's not an adaptive reuse example, it did not shy away from that very bold World Heritage site of the Royal Exhibition Building. And I remember when we had a big design competition in Melbourne around that, many of the entries did do how you spoke about the shrine. They sort of went under down, or they shied away from dealing with that relationship, whereas DCM's very bold forms set up a new relationship, which I think is important in heritage because it adds layers to our history and our development. So that's really speaking to a particular moment in Melbourne from the 1990s. And it's equally as strong as the Royal Exhibition Building.
In fact, it's our future heritage that those really strong and powerful architectural statements become our 20th century layer to our 19th century city, which are equally as important.
And how depressing if every bit of it is set back to not be seen. It's just such an absurd proposition.
But once again, Kirsten, it's a matter of balance, isn't it? Because you can overpower
we can all think of some terrible examples.
So, and maybe could we speak to some examples, Jill, in terms of not necessarily bad examples, but in terms of trying to deal with that issue of scale?
Do you know, in fact, Christine and I had a discussion about this at one stage, and I was trying to think of an example that goes high, that goes tall, that does have that sense of balance in Melbourne. And we did come up between us with which building? Russell Street, the old the old post office on Russell Street. And we decided that actually does it pretty well. There's quite an interesting sense of balance in that particular project. So that I'd give that one a tick, really, that does it. Probably one that is worth putting on the table is 80 Collins Street. And while I don't mean to be judgmental about it, because we architects do what we're asked to do, and that's one of the difficulties that we have with our profession. And in fact, it doesn't matter how good a designer you are, if you have development pressure on you to go to however many stories 80 Collins Street has gone to over the top of that little fragment on the corner of Collins and Russell, is it? Exhibition. Exhibition and Collins. And the fact that because the planning rules actually let you belly out over the building below, we can't argue about it. Like if you are allowed to occupy that airspace, then someone will do it. So I feel like we're almost at a point where if someone did a great review of Melbourne and said these sites are no-go zones, no, you can't build over the top of them, it makes it difficult and it's challenging for developers. But I think that's the difference between the European city, where they've had centuries of value attached to some of their buildings, and so their architects are so skillful at knowing how big to go.
But I think too, like even as you were saying that, and I was thinking, I think here we've still got this strange thing of not touching or juxtaposing or separating. And sometimes some of the most interesting versions, there's that Zumthor, it's a small scale, but the principle's more important. The church in Cologne, where it's sort of smeared between the old and the new brickwork. And I really like it as an example because it throws out the window all that business about careful separation. It says, actually, it's slightly ambiguous, and you're trying to work it out, and that's, of course you could work it out eventually, but it just creates more opportunities for how you might relate these elements. And I think sometimes it's where I think that the setback, which is resulting in these weird kind of, whale type mouths hanging over the top of these tiny little bite-sized buildings, then maybe there's other ways that, knowing that it's unlikely that we're about to pass any laws where suddenly someone is told you can't do anything on your site, you can imagine, although that is happening sometimes. Other ways that you might embed or encapsulate, or it's just to open the question up of ways of responding, because some of the standards are not working, or they're not producing particularly good outcomes.
So I think these are clearly issues that we're still struggling with within the discipline, within the profession, within the architectural community. But again, keeping in mind that we have many people watching who are not from within.
Yeah.
I think, Christine, it would be great perhaps to kind of come back to some properties of what we're talking about. So even the term adaptive reuse.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk about what that means? And you spoke about in your examples why one is better than the other. Can you kind of expand that a bit more generally, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So adaptive reuse, quite simply, is taking a building and adapting it for new purposes to which it was originally intended to be used for. And I gave the examples of many of our industrial buildings where technology has meant there's no use for these buildings in that particular manner anymore. So what can we do with those buildings that respects the fabric, the architecture, the relationship to the city and the existing surroundings, but give the building a new life and can be loved and appreciated in a new way? And I think the Tonkin, Zuleika and Greer example that I showed at Carriage Works is a really terrific example of that. So how do you...
We can see with that building in particular, with its recent closure, forced closure under COVID, how the community kind of rose up and were really desperate for
That's
that building
exactly
to survive.
right. Yeah. So it's injected culture and arts the way it's used in a very new way. So it's not just about the way that the architects have had the skill to deal with the fabric, but also in the way that they've designed it programmatically so that it can get used in a really delightful way in so many different ways. So it's quite flexible in the way it can be used.
Mind you, I was just going to say something that is really valuable in heritage is when a building still has its original use as well.
Yeah,
so you've got adaptive reuse, which is so important, but then you get buildings like Flinders Street Station that are still being used as a station, and it just adds that extra layer of value to them, to the state.
And that really speaks to the Borough Charter, which advocates if a building can be used in its original way, it should be.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important point to pick up, Jill, that there are some great examples of buildings that have been used in the same way for a very long time.
But interestingly, I think half the thrill of adaptive reuse, so from a use point of view, is when you get this strange, almost a misfit between the old forms and then the new uses. And so it's kind of wondrous because you end up in spaces, for instance, like Carriage Works, where the scale was for another purpose than to humans to walk around in an art space. And that's what's exciting. It's really compelling for people when you get exposed to this bigness sometimes, especially with industrial heritage. I think that's why people really enjoy something like the Tate, for instance, when you go in that turbine hall. It's just like, wow, I feel so tiny, and that's exciting because especially with the sorts of budget restraints and things, you are often doing bare minimums. And so suddenly
we kind of don't build it anymore, do we?
That's right. An excess and a thickness of wall that is just so hard to do now. So it's just this great opportunity for experience.
And Jill, I guess it kind of brings us back to some of the examples you showed, which were international. and we clearly have good examples here in Australia too. But, I mean, how does Melbourne fare when you kind of look at Melbourne in an international context? What kind of cities do you think we should be looking at to not necessarily mirror or try and emulate, but to learn from and bring into our own context?
Giant bug. I guess I used the Spanish example to start with, and I partly put that in there because a lot of the cities that have an extraordinarily long heritage also have an extraordinary history of architectural skill in dealing with that heritage, and they must learn how to do it. And I think we don't, and we're not really skillful at it. We don't have enough knowledge about it. We probably don't learn enough about this at our even through our universities. And we also, I think, Melbourne went through that era in the 60s and 70s where we just thought, oh, we're part of the new world. Let's get rid of all this old crappy stuff. And luckily we didn't get rid of all of it, but we did layer that with a whole lot of new work. But we're now I'd go so far as to say now we're starting to remove some of our 1960s buildings, which are actually really good, some of them. Yeah. And we've got to remember the value of our 19th century heritage, our 20th century heritage, and now our 21st century heritage. And we've got quite an extraordinary city that's got those three things that are working actually on top of each other. And not many cities have that, because most of the European cities isolate their historic centres. Yeah. And I think that's the point. We don't have an isolated centre. So the challenge for our designers is we're all working on top of each other, and I'm not sure that we're skilled enough to do it. Yeah. And I don't know if that's an unfair comment, but
I think Christine.
I just thought another area which I think our profession is only really starting to grapple with is our Indigenous history as well. So while we're focusing on conventional ideas of buildings and fabric, we're now beginning to understand and value the 60,000 plus years of our Indigenous history and how that can be given an identity and be celebrated within our cities and within our suburbs and so forth. So,
and Kirsten, you referenced that when talking about Broadmeadows and Robbie Rowlands and his artwork. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship with Broadmeadows, the project, the community, and also recognising unceded sovereignty?
Yeah. Well, there was just one thing I wanted to say before, and hopefully it's a way into that, is just to say I think Australian architects is a big call, but I notice this with students especially. I think a real challenge we have is how to interface different elements. I think we're quite used to, as architects, talking about the standalone object that's a problem in and of itself. But as soon as you put it in a city and it has multiple interfaces and a whole lot of things it has to do as a good citizen.
Context, that very important word,
Thank
context.
You. That's the word, context. then I think sometimes there's serious failings. So that's one thing I would say. And it probably does go to that question, maybe that's one way into it, is just failing to understand that no matter what you're starting with, you are always starting with something. And so it has a lot to do with what we choose to interpret as context. You know, context is never a neutral term. Put 10 different people in a space, depending on their backgrounds and their educations and all sorts of things, and they will probably see 10 very different things to describe what's important about that place. So I think as architects, for us to be maybe having an expanded understanding of what makes context is really important, whether you're thinking about it from an ecological one or the different ways it's been occupied and used by First Nations or even our migrant histories too, and how they're recorded in our cities. So we're getting better at it, but it's just so many ways to understand our starting points, and I think your starting point is what you're going to design to. So if you're only choosing to see that as your reference point, that's all you're likely to end up mirroring. So, yeah.
And can you maybe just unpack a little bit for people watching that process of just how the community were engaged in the process? You talked about creating these films that kind of documented the social history behind that project, working with artists. How do you kind of get that active engagement with people as you're going through the process?
Look, in the case of Broadmeadows, the council did do some quite intense workshops, which were ways to gather stories and memories. So I think that was one example, and that certainly was most explicitly picked up in Robbie's work, I think. And in fact, the quote of that piece comes from a man's description who had lived in the site area before it was built. So that was his description of those fields, etc. So that's a very sort of literal example. But look, I think it's a really hard one to answer, actually, because I think how you render stories through buildings it's a hard task. I mean, apart from just keeping them as they are, and so people with their memories, it aligns with their memories of it. That's sort of the easy way up. But how do future generations understand something of those stories? That's probably harder without resorting to plaques on walls and so on. So I don't know if I'm really going to be able to answer that, but it is a good question. And I know local architects trying to grapple with how we tell stories through architecture. There's some debate whether you can or how literal you might be in doing that. I think I would say it's important that many stories can be told through a place. So if it can stay alive to different people being able to use it and enjoy it, that's a fairly important way to keep it alive. So, yeah.
And maybe, Jill, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to speak to an example of perhaps a combination of new design and heritage that might have been considered at once controversial or kind of brought people into a debate with each other that now might actually be an example of a really good way to approach a project. How have we learnt from that process?
Let me think. I suspect every time we do a new work to a much-loved building, I think it's controversial. And I'm sure, I really can't remember when the shrine was done, but I suspect that would have been outrageously, I'm not sure why I can't remember, but I'm sure it was outrageously sensitive at the time. And I do remember when the architects won the big award for it that year, I remember them muttering under their breath to me, everyone's just so glad we didn't stuff that up.
Yeah, it's a fantastic project, that one.
And it was an amazing, radical way of dealing with things, but really in retrospect, not that radical and quite a clever and sensitive way of dealing with it. But I would imagine it's probably, it probably was controversial at the time, probably just that we were touching the shrine at all, I imagine, rather than what we were doing to it.
And I guess you could, I think that's an excellent example, actually, and much loved as a public space now. And I guess they're going through the same iteration or process with the Opera House now, where there is a sense of nervousness.
Now, there's a poison chalice. I mean, it's just so hard, isn't it? No matter how skillful, that will be contentious. But,
But embedded, the way the Opera House works is embedded within the site controls for the place is a series of principles established through the custodians of that site since Utzon designed and built it. And so there's processes in place which I guess you would call design governance, which is much like what we're hoping to get in place for Federation Square, that concept of eminent eyes kind of helping direct appropriateness, if that's a way of putting it.
That's an excellent point to bring you in on, Christine. Can you talk a little bit about Federation Square now from your perspective and what you think we've learnt from that process?
I think I have to be a bit careful here. I think what we've learnt is, and it's back to Kirsten's point about how old does a building need to be of heritage significance? And I think we actually learnt that in Melbourne when the total car park got listed as state heritage significance, which is a really well-known brutalist building. And I think there was discussion about, 1970s, is that heritage? And then that came out in a much greater way with Federation Square, because there were a lot of people who thought, well, 20 years old, is that really old enough to be considered heritage? And there are many different and complex debates around public space and the value of architecture for the public, that also wrapped around that debate of Federation Square. And I think it's quite interesting because I remember that building conjured up so many mixed responses when it was first built, and it was either a love or hate kind of response to the public. So it was really fascinating to see how much of the public had turned around in that short time and really grown to love and adore that space. And I say space because I think it's that,
absolutely,
which is what is important
to
about.
be fair, there was equal numbers that still hate it. I think it's interesting that it's still equally divided in all the research that was done.
Yeah.
So, heritage should win out because it becomes a sign of the times, a very important moment in Melbourne's architectural history. Yeah. But once again, it does need to be layered in some way, very carefully, through that kind of design governance model of what's okay.
But interestingly too, you can have governance and you can have principles. And I was just thinking this when you were talking about the Opera House. But in the end, no matter how many written things you may have, eventually it has to be spelt out in some kind of spatial move. Yeah. And then that's when no amount of, as much as we like to say the principles are here and we all agree on the principles, so therefore we'll agree on the solution. But it doesn't always happen that way. So that's where it's complex.
I absolutely agree. And ultimately, I guess in all the years of kind of being in a review circumstance, the fundamental issue is if you get a really good architect, they will do a really good job. Yeah. And that's why learning and training and developing skill and education and knowing how to do heritage or how to do the new with heritage is a very important skill for Melbourne architects to learn.
Yeah, that's right.
Now we're almost out of time, but before I wrap up, I just wanted to ask each of you to reflect a little bit about what you think, what is the most important message to get people in our city that are not architects necessarily or are not involved directly in the built environment. How do we engage them with issues of heritage in a more meaningful way? Christine, maybe I'll start with you and we'll come back to Jill and then Kirsten.
Well, I think Melbourne Open House is a really good place for everyone to start with, which is an epic nationwide international event where people can come along and see buildings that they might have not known anything about. It gets opened up to the public. You get tours, you get talks. So I think that's a really fantastic way for people to begin to discover and appreciate their heritage.
That's a really good point. I think I was going to say through living or life, and I think those open tours, it's exactly that. It's about being in these spaces, not just looking at them again as a sort of a thing from a distance to admire for its stylistic whatevers. It's getting people in and using them. So that's where I would probably say that sometimes I think if we frame it too in terms of our big pressing issues, like, for instance, why it's better to reuse if you can than start again, even from a position of resourcefulness, which I think is becoming increasingly important. So heritage is as much about preservation, if you like. Sometimes people see it as that, or keeping our links to the past, but it's also just making better use of what we already have, which just seems really sensible. And it has this bonus too of keeping us connected to our people's past. So, yeah.
And Jill, from the Victorian Government Architect perspective, how important is it for people to understand the kind of policies that are being made, the discussions in the newspapers, why they're happening?
I think we've got a very engaged community, and they do love to visit open house. It's extraordinary the numbers of people who go through those kind of programs. I guess my one thing that I would say is not every old building is a good building, and that bug just really
it's
wants me.
persistent.
And I suppose it's that question of trusting those that really do know whether that is a good building or not.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I do get worried that we hang on to fragments that are really questionable.
Like
and
a facadism
a
approach.
facade that is sort of embedded into the bottom of something that
Absolutely.
is highly questionable. And really, I suppose I would really like to think that every architect could do better or at least equal to the piece of old
absolutely.
building that's being hung onto. So I suppose it's a question of what's valuable history, what's valuable buildings, what's not. And I'm not sure exactly how to educate the public on that, because I think everyone, we've got a diverse population. Some love everything that's old, some don't. But I think that battle for the 60s and 70s architecture is something that is probably not a popular battle, and it's where the architectural voices need to be quite strong, because it's the architectural voices that understand in the history of Melbourne, these buildings are very important, and they might be a bit ugly, maybe, in somebody's lens, but I think it's important that those who make the judgment, that's why the Heritage Council exists. There's intelligence and an educative lens over the top of it.
I think that's a really important note to end on, and this idea of replacing something with equal, if not better, design value is something that everybody can relate to.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your generosity and your insights, Jill Garner, Christine Phillips, Kirsten Thompson, and on behalf of the Heritage Council of Victoria and the Office of the Government Architect, a big thank you to the MPavilion team for hosting today's discussion. And it's been just really fascinating, this discussion. So please log on and watch it over and over. Thank you.
Thanks, Fleur.
Thanks, Fleur.
Thank you.